In July 2013, the silence inside California's prisons was broken, not by violence but by hunger. Thousands of inmates, from San Quentin to Corcoran, refused their meals. At the heart of it all was Pelican Bay State Prison, the place the system called the end of the line. But for these men, it became the beginning of a movement that shook the foundations of solitary confinement itself. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a story that exposes how voices buried in concrete cells forced the entire state to listen. Pelican Bay State Prison sits on California's northern edge, surrounded by forests and fog, just 20 miles from the Oregon border. Built in 1989, it was designed for one purpose: to isolate. Inside its infamous Security Housing Unit, or SHU, prisoners spent 22 to 24 hours a day alone in windowless concrete cells. Meals came through slots in steel doors. Conversations echoed faintly through ventilation shafts. The system called it security. Inmates called it buried alive. By 2011, some men had spent over 20 years in isolation, many not for violent acts but for being validated as gang members. Validation didn't require committing a crime. It could be as minor as having a tattoo, a drawing, or being named in another inmate's statement. Once labeled, they could be held indefinitely with no fixed end date and no clear way out. Then came the spark. In the summer of 2011, a group of Pelican Bay inmates, many in their 50s and 60s, organized a peaceful hunger strike. They issued 5 core demands. End group punishment and administrative abuse. Abolish indefinite solitary confinement. Improve food quality and access to education. Expand contact with family. Create fair processes for gang validation. The strike drew national attention. Thousands joined in across the state. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, promised reform, but little changed. 2 years later, the inmates decided enough was enough. On July 8, 2013, they stopped eating again. But this time it wasn't hundreds. It was 29,000 inmates across 33 prisons, the largest coordinated prison hunger strike in U.S. history. The leadership came from the SHU's most isolated corners. Men like Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, Antonio Guillen, and Sitawa Nantambu Jamaa. From their 8x10 cells, they smuggled out statements, letters, and legal filings, rallying prisoners statewide. Despite being separated by concrete and barbed wire, their message traveled faster than any weapon ever could. We are human beings. The CDCR tried to dismiss the protest as gang manipulation. But journalists, families, and human rights groups saw something deeper: a human rights movement born in the harshest corners of the system. Inside Pelican Bay, the effects were immediate. Prison officials began confiscating letters, threatening participants, and performing wellness checks meant to intimidate. But the inmates refused food anyway. In the SHU, days blurred together. Some men reported dizziness, severe weight loss, and hallucinations. Others found strength in solidarity. For once, one inmate wrote, the silence between these walls carried meaning. Across the state, families protested outside courthouses, holding signs that read, "End torture in California prisons." The media, once silent, began asking questions. Lawmakers took notice. By late July, hearings were being scheduled in Sacramento. But inside Pelican Bay, the clock kept ticking. 10 days without food. Then 20. Then 30. Some collapsed. Others were hospitalized. The CDCR admitted that over 100 inmates were in critical condition. Still, the strike went on. And through it all, one truth grew impossible to ignore. This wasn't about gangs anymore. It was about what it means to be human in a place designed to erase humanity. By the second week of the hunger strike, California's prisons had become battlegrounds of endurance and perception. On one side, thousands of inmates refusing food, sustained only by water and solidarity. On the other, state officials determined to label the strike as a security threat, not a cry for human rights. At Pelican Bay, where the movement began, guards moved with tense precision. Medical staff visited the SHU daily, clipboards in hand, tracking vital signs: blood pressure, weight, pulse. Many inmates had already lost 15 to 20 pounds. Some trembled as they stood. Others couldn't stand at all. Yet the prison's internal communications, later leaked through court documents, revealed a chilling directive: maintain operations. Do not negotiate. To the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, giving in meant admitting that the men in solitary confinement had power. To the inmates, refusing to eat was the only power they had left. Meanwhile, across California's other prisons, from Corcoran to San Quentin, Folsom, and Tehachapi, the strike spread like a quiet storm. Food trays returned untouched. Inmates wrote messages on napkins, "We strike for humanity." Inside the prison yards, solidarity cut across racial and gang lines, a phenomenon almost unheard of in the state's violent prison culture. Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian inmates all joined in. The media, at first skeptical, began to pay attention. By July 22, 2013, the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and NPR had all published reports linking the strike to human rights violations. Amnesty International issued a statement condemning California's use of indefinite isolation, calling it inhumane and potentially unlawful. One of the strike's main organizers, Todd Ashker, managed to get a letter smuggled out through his attorney. It was read aloud at a rally in Sacramento. "This is not about gangs or politics. This is about basic human dignity. The right to sunlight. The right to sanity. The right to be seen as more than a number." That letter changed everything. Lawmakers could no longer ignore what was happening behind the razor wire. Assemblyman Tom Amiano and Senator Lonnie Hancock, both longtime critics of prison conditions, announced a series of legislative hearings. The goal? To review the use of solitary confinement in California's prisons, a practice that, at the time, kept over 3,000 people in isolation, some for decades. The CDCR responded with its own narrative. In press releases, officials described the hunger strike as a manipulation by gang leaders seeking more privileges. They distributed photos of clean cells and organized files to reporters, insisting conditions were humane. But inmates' families told a different story. Mothers spoke of sons they hadn't hugged in 20 years. Wives described voices fading over crackling phone lines. One woman told reporters, "I send letters every week. He says they put him in a cell so small he can't stretch his arms. How is that rehabilitation?" The clash between image and reality became impossible to ignore. Outside Pelican Bay, hundreds of protesters gathered with banners reading "Stop the Torture." Inside, the hunger strikers pressed on, though their bodies began to fail them. Some went blind from vitamin deficiency. Others were placed on 4 drips against their will. By mid-August, more than 100 inmates had been hospitalized. Prison doctors warned of organ failure. But the leaders refused to end the strike without a concrete promise of reform. "We are already buried alive," one prisoner wrote. "If we die, at least the world will know why." The governor's office finally broke its silence. Governor Jerry Brown, when asked about the strike, dismissed it as a prison management issue. Yet, behind the scenes, his staff began contacting legal advocates, exploring potential compromises to end the crisis. The system was under pressure, from the public, from lawmakers, and even from international observers. The question was no longer whether California could afford to change its solitary policies. It was whether it could survive the consequences if it didn't. By late August, 2 months into the strike, the movement reached its breaking point. Inmates were fainting in their cells. Hospitals were full. And yet, the men in the SHU kept fasting. The CDCR realized something that terrified them more than hunger itself. The prisoners had already won the moral war. The state could control their bodies. But it couldn't silence their message anymore. By early September 2013, the hunger strike had stretched to nearly 60 days. The numbers had dwindled. Some inmates were too weak to continue, but the message had reached every corner of California's prison system and far beyond. For the men in the SHU at Pelican Bay, this was no longer a protest. It was survival turned into purpose. Every day without food was a message written on their bodies. Every heartbeat a demand for change. Medical reports were alarming. Prison doctors documented cases of organ failure, severe dehydration, and collapsing immune systems. Inmates' lips cracked from dryness. Some vomited bile. Others fell unconscious during routine checks. But when offered food, most shook their heads. The CDCR faced mounting pressure. Families of inmates flooded the phone lines of the governor's office, while human rights organizations launched petitions and demonstrations in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Sacramento. For the first time in years, the issue of solitary confinement was headline news. The turning point. On August 23, 2013, state lawmakers held a public hearing on solitary confinement. The event, streamed live and reported widely, was packed with journalists, activists, and former prisoners. A former Pelican Bay inmate, Gabriel Reyes, testified that he had spent over a decade in the SHU. "I watched men talk to themselves," he said. "I watched others bang their heads on the wall until blood came. And I watched the state call that rehabilitation. Lawmakers sat in stunned silence. Then came a moment that changed the course of the hearing. A mother stood up holding a framed photo of her son. "He's in Pelican Bay," she said, her voice trembling. "He's not a monster. He's my child. And he hasn't touched sunlight in 14 years. That clip aired on local and national networks the same night. Public outrage exploded. Editorials across California called the SHU system a moral failure. The New York Times described it as the closest thing to psychological torture on U.S. soil. Governor Jerry Brown and CDCR Secretary Jeffrey Beard were forced to respond. They released a joint statement saying that constructive steps were underway to address inmates' concerns, but the hunger strikers weren't convinced. For decades they'd heard promises. This time they wanted signatures. The negotiation table. Behind closed doors, the state quietly reached out to attorneys representing the inmates. One of those attorneys was Carol Strickman, a senior staff lawyer with legal services for prisoners with children. Another was Jules Lobel, president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR. Lobel would later tell reporters, "These men, through starvation, did what years of legal briefs could not. They forced the world to look inside Pelican Bay." In early September 2013, after 59 days, a fragile truce was reached. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation agreed to hold official legislative hearings and to begin reviewing the use of indefinite solitary confinement. The inmates suspended the strike. In total, the protest had involved 29,000 prisoners, spanned 2 months, and claimed several hospitalizations, but not a single act of violence. It was one of the largest nonviolent demonstrations in U.S. prison history. The CDCR framed the resolution as a dialogue toward progress. But for the men who had starved themselves, it was something deeper, a proof that even buried in concrete they could still shake the walls. The lawsuit that changed everything. 2 years later, the promises made during the strike became a legal battle. Ashker versus Governor of California. In 2015, the case reached a landmark settlement. Under federal oversight, the state of California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement in its prisons. The new policy required that no inmate could be held in solitary solely based on gang affiliation. Isolation must be reviewed regularly with clear criteria for release. The longest periods of confinement would require specific behavioral justification, not suspicion. For the first time, hundreds of men who had lived decades without daylight were moved into general population units or special transitional programs. Todd Ashker, one of the lead plaintiffs, said in a statement, "We stood up with nothing but our hunger and we won back our humanity." That single sentence echoed through the same walls that once silenced him. Legacy and impact. The 2013 hunger strike did more than change policy. It redefined what resistance could look like inside a cage. It showed that unity, even among those divided by race, gang, or geography, could force the state to listen. By 2016, California had reduced its SHU population by over 1,200 inmates, closing several units entirely. And while solitary confinement still exists, the era of lifelong isolation for suspected gang ties was finally over. For those who led the movement, the scars never faded. Many still suffer from post-SHU syndrome, a psychological trauma caused by years in isolation. But their fight carved a path for prison reform activists nationwide, inspiring similar movements in New York, Illinois, and Washington state. As one Pelican Bay survivor wrote years later, "We didn't have microphones or protests in the streets. We had silence. And somehow, that silence was loud enough to be heard." When the 2013 Pelican Bay hunger strike finally ended, the silence that followed was unlike anything California's prison system had ever heard. It wasn't just the silence of men recovering from starvation. It was the silence of a system realizing it could no longer hide behind concrete walls. For years, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, had insisted that security housing units, the SHUs, were essential for controlling gang violence. But after nearly 2 months of statewide protest and the international outrage that followed, the narrative began to crack. In September 2013, as part of its agreement with lawmakers and advocates, the CDCR began what it called a comprehensive housing review. Officials promised to evaluate every inmate held in long-term isolation. That meant revisiting the cases of men who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years locked in concrete boxes the size of parking spaces. Behind those steel doors, the news spread slowly, but when it did, the reaction was disbelief. One inmate later wrote in a letter to his lawyer, "For the first time, I dared to imagine sunlight. I didn't know what to do with that thought. The long road to reform. The hunger strike hadn't just rattled the public, it had also forced the courts into motion. In 2015, the lawsuit Ashker versus Governor of California reached a historic settlement. The agreement was clear. Indefinite solitary confinement would end. Inmates could no longer be placed in isolation merely for being labeled as gang affiliates. The state had to establish new step-down programs to help those leaving solitary reintegrate into the general population. Regular reviews would be mandatory for anyone still held in the SHU. The decision meant freedom for hundreds of men who had been buried in the system's darkest corners. At Pelican Bay, some of the longest-held prisoners walked into the open yard for the first time in decades. They looked up at the sky, something they hadn't seen without bars in over 20 years. One of them, an inmate named Sitawa Nantambu Jamaa, later described that moment. It was like being reborn. The air burned my lungs because I wasn't used to breathing it. Over the next year, California transferred nearly 1,200 prisoners out of indefinite isolation. The number of people held in SHU conditions dropped by more than 80%. Human rights groups hailed it as a victory, a turning point in America's long and controversial history with solitary confinement. But inside the CDCR, not everyone agreed. The resistance within. Some correctional officers saw the reforms as a threat. They argued that taking gang members out of isolation would spark violence in the general population. Union representatives warned that staff safety was at risk. In internal memos obtained by journalists, prison officials debated quietly, was California reforming too fast? In the following years, a few violent incidents reignited the old fears, giving critics ammunition to say the SHU system had been necessary all along. But data told a different story. By 2018, according to reports from the Prison Law Office and the Center for Constitutional Rights, the overall violence in California prisons did not increase after the SHU reforms. In some facilities it even declined. The CDCR, under new leadership, began introducing rehabilitative programs, vocational training, therapy groups and limited access to education, for those leaving isolation. The era of endless darkness was ending, slowly but undeniably. The human cost. Still, for many who endured solitary, freedom came at a price. Doctors and psychologists studying long-term isolation described symptoms that persisted long after release: paranoia, insomnia, flashbacks, and depression. Experts coined a name for it: post-SHU syndrome. One Pelican Bay survivor described it bluntly. You can open the cell door, but the cell stays inside your head. For those who had led the 2013 strike, Ashker, Castellanos, Guillen, and Jamaa, their names became symbols in the movement for prison reform. Yet even as they gained recognition, many of them remained incarcerated, serving long sentences for crimes unrelated to the hunger strike. But their impact reached far beyond their own cases. In the years that followed, other states began re-evaluating their use of isolation. New York passed laws restricting solitary to 15 consecutive days. New Jersey and Colorado imposed stricter oversight. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture cited the Pelican Bay strike as a defining moment in the global fight against prolonged isolation. The hunger strike had started in a cell block built to erase individuality. Yet somehow, it reshaped laws, policies, and international standards on human rights. Pelican Bay today. More than a decade later, Pelican Bay remains open, but changed. The Security Housing Unit, once the heart of California's solitary system, now houses far fewer inmates. Its corridors are quieter not because of fear but because fewer men live there. New murals have appeared in the general yard, painted by former SHU inmates who now use art as therapy. Some depict hands reaching toward light. Others show the faces of men who never made it out. Community groups visit regularly to teach workshops and organize reintegration programs. For the first time, Pelican Bay has rehabilitation initiatives aimed at helping inmates transition to society rather than vanish from it. Still, the scars are visible. In interviews, correctional staff admit that the prison will never escape its history. But to the men who survived the 2013 hunger strike, that's exactly the point. They don't want it forgotten. "We fought to make sure no one else lives and dies in a box," one former striker wrote in 2020. History will remember us as the men who starved for justice. A movement that didn't end. The legacy of the Pelican Bay hunger strike continues to inspire documentaries, university research, and activism worldwide. Organizations like the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition and the Center for Constitutional Rights still cite it as a case study in organized, peaceful resistance under extreme repression. In 2023, the 10th anniversary of the strike was marked with a vigil outside Pelican Bay's gates. Families, former inmates and activists gathered in the cold Crescent City air, holding candles and photos of the men who started it all. One sign read, "They took our food but they couldn't take our humanity." As the sun set behind the tall fences and gun towers, the crowd fell silent, just as the men inside had done 10 years before. And in that silence the message was the same. Change begins when those with nothing left choose to speak without words. A decade after the hunger strike at Pelican Bay, the story still echoes, not through the loudspeakers of the prison, but through the corridors of human rights courts, legislative halls and classrooms around the world. It's a story that began with silence. Men locked away for decades, forgotten by society, choosing to use the only weapon they had left, their own bodies. And in the end, that silence became a sound too loud for the world to ignore. The global ripple effect. The 2013 Pelican Bay hunger strike became more than an American prison protest. It became a global reference point in the debate over solitary confinement. In 2015, the United Nations Mandela Rules were officially adopted, setting international standards for the treatment of prisoners. One of its most striking provisions was Rule 43, which explicitly defines prolonged solitary confinement, more than 15 consecutive days, as a form of torture. Human rights experts credited the California strike for bringing visibility to an issue long buried in policy reports and footnotes. Organizations from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Center for Constitutional Rights cited Pelican Bay as a turning point that forced democratic societies to confront their own moral contradictions. Around the world, prison systems took notice. In Norway, prisons moved toward rehabilitation-based models, emphasizing community re-entry instead of isolation. In Canada, the federal court struck down indefinite solitary confinement as unconstitutional in 2019. In the United Kingdom, parliamentary debates referenced the Pelican Bay strike when reviewing their own long-term segregation policies. Even within the United States, the hunger strike reshaped language. Politicians once afraid to challenge the prison system began speaking openly about human dignity. Activists reframed solitary confinement not as a disciplinary tool, but as a moral crisis. The men who started it all. Of the four lead organizers, Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, Antonio Guillen, and Sitawa Nantambu Jamaa, all spent decades inside the Pelican Bay SHU. Their names, once printed on disciplinary reports, are now printed in academic journals, legal studies, and documentaries. They never met face-to-face during the strike. Their messages were passed through walls, lawyers, and smuggled letters. Yet together they achieved something no riot, no lawsuit, and no rebellion had ever done before. They forced the state of California to change from the inside. Ashker once wrote from his cell after the settlement, "They tried to bury us alive but they forgot we were seeds." That quote became the symbol of the movement, printed on banners, tattoos, and protest posters from Los Angeles to London. For decades, prisons had operated on one simple principle: isolate and control. But the men of Pelican Bay proved that even isolation can't control the idea of freedom. Beyond the bars, society's reflection. The story of the 2013 hunger strike also forced ordinary Americans to ask uncomfortable questions. If rehabilitation is the goal of incarceration, what does it mean to lock a human being in darkness for 20 years? If justice is blind, who watches over the places where sight is forbidden? For journalists, filmmakers, and advocates, Pelican Bay became a lens, a way to expose how a democracy could normalize conditions that the United Nations defined as inhumane. Since then, documentaries, research papers, and educational programs have continued to dissect what happened in those months of protest. Universities across the country teach the Pelican Bay case in criminology and human rights courses, analyzing how collective resistance behind bars reshaped state policy. In 2020, the state of California officially announced the closure of several SHU units, citing the success of rehabilitative alternatives. It was a bureaucratic way of admitting something much larger. The men who went hungry in 2013 had changed the system forever. The new generation of voices. Younger activists, some children of the very men who participated in the strike, have carried the message forward. They organize rallies, publish essays, and speak at conferences under banners reading, "No human being deserves to live in a cage." Podcasts and YouTube channels dedicated to criminal justice reform now tell the story to new audiences, many who were too young to remember when the strike happened. Through their work, the legacy of Pelican Bay lives on in digital form, the next generation keeping alive the message their fathers whispered through steel doors. One former inmate now mentors youth in Los Angeles, telling them, "We changed the law without lifting a fist. That's what real power looks like." The meaning of the strike. At its core, the hunger strike wasn't just about food or policy. It was about recognition, the simple human need to be seen, to be heard, and to matter. When the men of Pelican Bay refused to eat, they were making a declaration that transcended walls and fences. We are more than the crimes we committed. We are human beings. And that message, though born in the darkest corners of America's prison system, illuminated something about the world outside too, about how society chooses to treat those it cannot forgive. Because if dignity can survive inside Pelican Bay, maybe it can survive anywhere. The story of the Pelican Bay hunger strike of 2013 isn't just a chapter in prison history, it's a reminder of what happens when silence becomes resistance, and when justice demands sacrifice. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, where truth replaces rumor and humanity replaces fear, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it so more people understand the fight that happened behind those concrete walls. Because sometimes, the loudest voices are the ones the world tried hardest not to hear.